Hello, I'm Alec Avdakov, and welcome to the Life and Times of Frederick the Great. Today's episode will explore one of Frederick's most famous military-minded books, Instructions for His General. So, if you're a military history buff, this is your kind of episode. We'll discuss the context behind why this book was written, the book itself, and the overall impact of this book. But let's jump right into it. Directly after the Peace of Dresden on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1745, Frederick had a great deal on his mind. In a short 5 years on the throne, Frederick had elevated his country, Prussia, from a regional German power that could be compared to Bavaria and Saxony to a respected power that defeated Austria. Despite this story of triumph, anxiety best described Frederick's mood after the war. He realized that Maria Theresa's Austria would be his most implacable foe. But the old saying goes, action is the antithesis to anxiety. And Frederick, even if you despise him, was absolutely a man of action. Frederick wanted his generals to understand the responsibilities of being a general in the Prussian army. He needed them to know the logistics, management details, and the tactics and strategies that would make great unit leaders. Therefore, almost immediately after the war, Frederick set out writing in French a book that would help teach his generals these skills. The book would be titled Les principes généraux de la guerre appliqués à la tactique et à la discipline de les troupes prussiennes. But we will simply call them Instructions to His Generals. It would be first completed on April 2nd, 1748, and would be translated in German in 1753. Consider how much of an innovation a standardized manual for a general is. In a world where an army would have entirely different uniforms for different regiments, this was a huge step forward for making a cohesive uniform army. The book itself is not very long, being a little over 100 pages in a physical copy. The translation I used for research was online, and a link is in the show notes below. The book is split into 26 articles, or chapters, as we would normally call them. I will now go into a little bit of detail about what was written in the articles from Articles 1 to 26. Article 1, which would suggest that this is the most important thing a general must know when commanding, discusses desertion and ways to prevent soldiers from deserting. Yes, tactics are incredibly crucial to winning battles and wars. But Frederick knew that even the best trained armies wouldn't fight unless the men were physically there. Frederick wrote how his army, quote, are composed half of our own people and half foreigners who enlist for money. The latter only wait for a favorable opportunity to quit the service to which they have no particular attachment. He listed 14 ways a general could prevent men from deserting, including for generals to not take marches through dense forests unless necessary, calling roll throughout the day, avoiding night marches, being aware of what issues and problems soldiers have, and making sure a soldier is paid and fed. He explains the extraordinary ability of the Prussian soldier as long as discipline is maintained. He wrote, quote, with troops like these, the world itself might be subdued if conquests were not as fatal to the victors as to the vanquished. Article 2 is concerned with supplying food to his soldiers. He writes about having major supply magazines secure behind the front lines because if crap hits the fan, the army will still be supplied with bread. Frederick also engages in casual anti-Semitism when he writes, quote, purveyors are never to be employed but in cases of the last necessity, for even Jews are less exorbitant in their demands. We will eventually talk about Frederick's contempt for Jewish people, but let's move on for now. He also said that horse-drawn covered wagons should be used to transport supplies to the soldiers. Frederick said that oxes were not the move. Frederick stated that armies in Saxony and Silesia were dependent on the two rivers, the Elbe and the Oder, to transport supplies. The main vehicle to transport the food to the men would be the covered wagon. If you're in the US, think about the wagons on the Oregon Trail. These wagons would need to travel in a convoy protected, as Frederick wrote, by light cavalry hussars rather than infantry. He stressed that, quote, the general of an army cannot be too anxious about the security of his convoys. Now, on to Article 3, which is extremely short. This one just talks about how an army needs to be well supplied with beer and meat. With a little bitterness, remembering the disaster of the Bohemian Campaign of 1744, Frederick writes in this article, quote, Bohemia, where the country is but a little better than a desert. Frederick stated that cattle herds should follow the army with the convoys so that a soldier can be fed 2 pounds of bread per day and 2 pounds of meat per week. Article 4 is concerned with forage, aka food for horses. Remember that at this time, horses were the tanks, trucks, and scouting planes of an army, all wrapped into one. But horses need a lot of particular food to remain healthy. Frederick writes that dry forage includes, quote, oats, barley, hay, and chopped straw. Frederick writes that he could get away with starting a winter campaign in 1740 in Silesia because he was close to supply magazines and the Oder River, whereas in Bohemia or Moravia, he writes that, quote, you must wait to the arrival of spring unless you mean to destroy all your cavalry. He then talks about the process of foraging. The column should be led with hussars, then foragers directly behind them, followed by a mixed force of infantry and cavalry, then foragers. This pattern should continue until the rear, which is guarded with hussars. Frederick stresses that a foraging party must be well guarded when he writes, quote, I would rather send out the parties twice than occupy too great an area at once. Remember that without horses being properly fed, there is no way an army could ever succeed during this time period. Article 5 is for all you geography nerds out there. In short, the general must know the terrain he is to march his army through like the back of his hand. He must know where the high ground is, the depths of the rivers around him, the course and condition of the roads. He must scout woods the army marches through and where good places are for fields of battle or a camp. This was the beginning of the era of more accurate army maps. In a world of completely accurate satellite maps, we forget that people like the Romans mainly used mile markers and itinerary lists of cities rather than maps. With the availability of printed paper and accurate tools to survey the land, the 18th century became the time when accurate maps were made and printed. This was still a time when maps were not entirely accurate, however, and Frederick writes that personal scouting was necessary when he says, quote, when we can make use of our own eyes, we ought never to trust those of other people. Articles 6 and 7 are mainly about the deployment and distribution of troops on a given ground. Frederick gave general guidelines that a skilled general could tell the advantages of any ground for setting up camps, organizing fortifications, and how to protect the flanks of the camps. The different arms of the army must be placed on the correct terrain. According to Fritz, the cavalry is best used in a plain, whereas the infantry can be put in any situation. The classic battle formation of this time was having the cavalry on the two sides or wings or flanks of the army with the infantry in the center. However, Frederick believes this formation should not be automatically used in any situation. He wrote, quote, "If your cavalry be posted with a morass or bog in its front, it is impossible that it can render you any service." In short, a commander must be flexible when deciding where to position his troops. Your battle formation will be ineffective if you fall too closely to tradition. Articles 8 and 9 go incredibly deep into detail about setting up camps, but I won't go too into it. Frederick uses the Roman military camps as a framework for how he sets up his camps. He stresses the point that there must be some sort of an escape plan for any camp. Fritz writes that if an army can't escape, then a general would, quote, "be obliged to submit to the greatest indignity which a soldier can suffer, that of laying down his arms without the power of defending himself." A general must also know the best terrain and geography for different types of camp. And Frederick, throughout this first section in general, always stresses that the flanks or sides of a camp, foraging party, or army must be well protected. The flanks are always the most vulnerable to attack. Article 10 finally deals with matters of army operations. Frederick covered the foundation of an army with a layer of planning and logistics as any professional should. But now we get into, in my opinion, the more interesting second half of the book. The 10th chapter ponders the idea of splitting the army in detachments. Based on his experiences in the Silesian Wars, Frederick wrote that you should only split your army when you absolutely have to. Frederick even admits that he, quote, "should have been defeated at Soor, and deservedly too." A rare show of humility for the king. He says that on the offensive, the army should never be split unless in Bohemia to ensure supplies. But on the defensive, generals in command of detachments should have the overall choice of whether to fight or get the heck out of there. Considering how much of a control freak Frederick is, it makes sense why he would hate detachments. Frederick ends the chapter by writing, quote, "Detachments which weaken the army one half, or even a third part, are excessively dangerous and strongly to be disapproved." In Article 11, Frederick discusses how to trick your enemy with different strategies. In short, this section is about mind games to confuse and deceive your enemies. If you want to fight a battle, but your enemy does not want to, change the circumstances so that your army looks weak. If you don't want to fight, make your army look as formidable as possible. Frederick wrote, quote, "Austria is a famous school for this sort of maneuver, for with them the art is brought to its greatest perfection." Frederick also writes, as if to foreshadow a future war when a commander crosses the Delaware River, that, quote, "the best stratagem is to lull the enemy into security at the time when the troops are about to disperse and go into winter quarters, so that by retiring you may be enabled to advance on them to some good purpose. With this in view, the troops should be so distributed as to assemble again very readily in order to force the enemy's quarters." So in short, a quick winter assault can turn the momentum of a bad campaign. The moral of this article is to be sure to keep your enemy guessing. Article 12 is all about spies and intelligence. Frederick lists out 4 different kinds of spies: commoners and deserters, double spies, spies of consequence, and people who are, quote, "compelled to take up the unpleasant business." He considers the commoners the least important when obtaining information. But double spies, according to Frederick, are great at spreading disinformation to your enemy. The spies who are forced into it sound similar to the scene in the movie Barry Lyndon. Apparently, Frederick would, quote, "find a rich citizen who has a large family and good estate, and give him a servant who knows the language and culture of the area he will spy on. Frederick stated that he would threaten the man that if he did not return to Prussia, he would have his house burnt to the ground and his family killed. So, that's pretty dark. Anyway, on to Article 13. This is more regarding intelligence. However, this section talks more about discovering what the enemy army plans to do based on their behavior. For example, if the Austrian army cooks their food, it means they plan to march. A general can also learn what an enemy plans on doing based on what unit they use to observe and attack you. A lot is said of the Austrian light troops at this time. The 14th article discusses the varying reactions of the people where the army is occupied. Frederick writes that the three kinds of country an army occupies are either friendly, neutral, or enemy. Frederick also says that when marching through a Protestant country, the Prussian army should, quote, wear the mask of the protector of the Lutheran religion. But the Prussians should preach tolerance in Catholic countries. But in Bohemia, the people should not, quote, be trusted any farther than you can see them. Frederick roasts the Bohemian and Moravian people by calling them, quote, errant traitors. According to Frederick, the only upside was that Maria Theresa was raising taxes in Bohemia. That way, the Prussians could maybe woo the Bohemians with good treatment. Article 15 discusses how a general should approach different kinds of marches. Frederick had a whole system in place for how generals should order their armies when retreating, marching parallel to the enemy, and marching through a defile or a narrow gorge. For all of these situations, the infantry and cavalry should be supporting one another and ordered based on the terrain surrounding them. The chapter goes more in depth about which regiments should be placed where due to reasons of standardization. If an army automatically marches where they need to go without thinking, there is less room for error. Article 16 is where Frederick writes about his lessons from the disaster of the 1744 retreat from Bohemia. The topic is how to retreat when being harassed by hussars and light infantry. Frederick characteristically writes about his contempt for light troops when he writes, quote, they are never brave but when animated by the hope of plunder, or when they can annoy others without exposing themselves. He says that light troops can cause the most damage to any army in heavy forests, defiles, or mountains. Can you guess where there are a bunch of those? Bohemia, of all places. The same place he retreated from in 1744. Frederick recommended that the front section of the army should occupy high ground of the area where the main army should just continue marching as if nothing is happening. The Prussian army should make short and deliberate marches when being stalked by light troops. Article 17 is just a small chapter that says how to attack an area commanded by light troops. Frederick just says to run pell-mell at the enemy light troops because they won't stand and fight. The 18th article is about persuading the enemy army to move. According to Frederick, the general should keep in mind that the movement he makes should cause the enemy to be put in a worse situation. He lists off multiple ways to get the enemy to move, such as moving to the flanks of the army, attacking the supply magazines, getting between the enemy and his capital, etc. Frederick cautions that any maneuver a general should make should always put the enemy at a disadvantage rather than yourself. Article 19 is all about making river crossings. What the army should do is basically the grand scale version of, hey, look what's behind you, and running in the opposite direction. The main army should make a great show of marching to a spot, and the actual crossing should be kept top secret. Then that night, the army should march to the crossing while the bridge is being prepared during the previous days. Frederick stated that the bridge should always be fortified. Frederick gave a huge disclaimer regarding Article 20. The topic is defending river crosses, and Frederick points out that this is nearly impossible to do. Frederick stated that unless the front he was to defend was less than 37 miles, and there were fortifications on the defending side, there was no point in defending the river. But if there was a possibility in defending the river, then the river should be constantly scouted by light cavalry and sentries. Frederick states that detachments should be, quote, commanded by the most active and intelligent officers of dragoons and hussars. If a bridge is discovered and the enemy has made a bridgehead on the opposite bank, the general should attack with all speed with infantry. But Frederick ends the chapter by saying that small rivers, and most rivers in general, are pointless to defend. Article 21 overviews how to surprise a fortified city or town. A town could be surprised by an accident during a probing attack, overconfidence leading to a false sense of security, or betrayal from the inside. Article 22 is an extremely crucial chapter in which Frederick talks about battle. Again, notice how much a general must consider before even whiffing the scent of battle. We are nearly almost done with the book, are only now considering battlefield tactics. This chapter is extremely long, so I will cover this in slightly more depth than previous chapters. The first small section of this chapter talks about how to attack an enemy camp that does not know of your presence. The cavalry should lead the attack, followed by 2 attack columns of infantry so that the cavalry can be supported. The attack should take place just a half an hour before sunrise. Frederick admits that the Battle of Mollwitz should have occurred like this, but he made an error. However, Frederick admits that he is not a fan of night attacks due to the confusion that ensues just after the attack starts. Secondly, Fritz discusses how to attack an enemy that is entrenched. Frederick states that speed is key when attacking entrenchments. He writes, quote, "What would be of advantage today may not be of tomorrow." However, that area must be scouted well before with your own eyes. According to Frederick, a vast trench network should be attacked from multiple sides because he who defends everywhere defends nowhere. When a force of infantry attacks the entrenchments, they should be followed by some engineers to clear a path for the eventual cavalry attack. The infantry should support the cavalry when their attack is made. That way, if the first attack is not successful, the subsequent attacks will be. Frederick also proclaims that defending entrenchments is a bad idea. That thought being that if they lose the trenches, the army would disintegrate. Nevertheless, he does explain how to entrench the army if that situation were to arise. The trenches should be in a zigzag formation with redoubts or mini fortresses at the corner of each zag. The cavalry should be in reserve, and there should be cover such as high ground or woods. The soldiers in the trenches should not be overexcited to fire their muskets, but should conserve their fire for maximum damage. Thirdly, Frederick discusses how futile it is for an army to be stretched out in a line to defend a vast area. The attacker can simply choose one point in the line and concentrate on a single weak point in this line. The next part of this chapter is extremely important. If a military historian could choose a trademark for Frederick's tactical style, this would be it. I am, of course, talking about the oblique order of battle. To put it simply, the oblique order is when you strengthen one flank of your army to go around the flank of your enemy. Frederick words it like this, quote, "You refuse one wing to your enemy, whilst you strengthen that which you ought to make the attack. By this means, you turn all your force on that wing of the enemy, which you take in flank." Frederick's reasoning behind this attack formation was that Prussia would almost always be outnumbered by her enemies. Therefore, a swift attack where the enemy is weakest would weaken the enemy's ability to fight and lead to a quick war. Frederick did not believe that Prussia could survive a long war of attrition. However, if you concentrate all your army's power against one sector of your enemy's army, you would hold local superiority in numbers. This would help Frederick win the short, decisive battle to win any future war. So, whenever you listen to this podcast in the future, keep in mind the oblique order of battle. After that, he focuses on how to attack an enemy that has villages on two wings of the army. Frederick stated that a village should never be attacked unless you are desperate, and that the center should instead be attacked. He essentially regurgitates what happened at the Battle of Kesselsdorf. The Prussians should make a probing attack at the center, fall back to get the enemy to move off their defenses, and then turn right back around when the enemy least expects it. Frederick also addresses some points about tactics. The infantry, when advancing against an enemy line, should never fire a shot unless commanded to do so. Frederick was a firm believer in Prussian discipline and bayonets winning the day, rather than firepower. Frederick then makes a point about cavalry. During a battle, their main jobs are to clear the enemy wings of cavalry, pursue and cut them off from the infantry, attack the infantry in flank or charge when there is confusion in enemy lines, and to take prisoners once the battle is victorious. He then discusses that the army, after a victorious battle, should pursue the enemy to make the victory more complete. That is, unless the troops are out of supplies or are exhausted. If the army is beaten, then they should refer back to his article on retreat and go to a defile to take cover. If there is unavailable cover, a section of the army should form a square to fend off further attacks while the rest of the army finds a better position. Phew! That was a long chapter. Article 23 points out the reasons for why a battle should be undertaken in the first place. Frederick opens with something that is quintessentially Frederick. Quote, "Battles determine the fate of nations." Frederick argues that a commander should choose to engage in a battle whenever there is an advantage to be gained. Frederick also warns against long wars when he writes, quote, "A long war must tend insensibly to relax our admirable discipline, depopulate our country, and exhaust our resources. Prussia should instead fight a short and sharp war." Now, on to Article 24, which is a small, according to Frederick, overview of some of the mistakes a general can make. Frederick remarks that, quote, "Generals are much more to be pitied than is generally imagined. This is due to how much responsibility they have when commanding troops, and the multitude of errors that occurs under them." Frederick warns that if a general of a key unit is to be killed or become sick, bad stuff is going to happen. He also cautions not to give too much power to a single subordinate. This is because if the messenger who carries the order becomes lost or interprets the order incorrectly, the whole battle could be a disaster. Article 25 just says that councils of war suck. The general should hardly ever put his plans up for discussion unless entirely necessary. Article 26 is another shorty that just describes the purpose of this book. In Frederick's view, the Prussian discipline in the army is the only way for Prussia to survive. It must rely on its innovations on tactics and command to win any future wars. Article 27 is all about winter quarters, and Frederick warns not once, but twice to be completely sure that the enemy is done for the year, and to keep a close eye on whether the enemy makes a move. Winter should be a time to repair, re-drill, and recruit the men for next year. An interesting thing about this chapter is that when the army was encamped on foreign soil, the officers would all receive a raise. The regular soldiers would just be given better and more food because money, quote, only tends to favor desertion. The final chapter, Article 28, talks about winter campaigns. Frederick opens the chapter by saying, quote, winter campaigns ruin the troops, both on account of the diseases which they occasion and by obliging them to be constantly in motion. But he clarifies this because he himself had 3 winter campaigns by the time he wrote this book. According to Frederick, these were situations where he felt there was no other option. Frederick writes that decisive movement is even more crucial in the winter because the troops are more likely to be exhausted and become sick. The upside is that the enemy will be more likely to be surprised. Frederick ends the book by saying to reach out to him for clarification or for further explanation. He concludes by saying, quote, I shall not think my moments misemployed if what I have said should stimulate my officers to the study of that science which will afford them the most certain opportunity of acquiring glory and rescuing their names from the rust of oblivion and securing them, their brilliant actions, a glorious and immortal fame. This book was handed out to Frederick's generals in 1753 as a type of secret holy book. The generals were, according to Christopher Duffy's book on Frederick's military life, quote, not to leave the book lying around or even to read it in the presence of servants. The book was captured by the Austrians in the aftermath of a skirmish near Kostorf on February 20th, 1760. The book was then published widely in 1762. Overall, it was met with positive reception and even awe from generals from even the Austrian side. So, what can we learn from this deep dive of Frederick the Great's general principles of war in the context of 1748? Well, consider one of the maxims that have been repeated throughout the book. He who defends everywhere defends nowhere. An army must act together with cooperation, speed, and decisiveness to gain its objectives. Consider also how long it took before we began to discuss battle tactics. An amateur talks tactics, while professionals discuss logistics. You can see this throughout this book as well. Much effort and consideration was given by Frederick about supply and keeping his soldiers fed. There is also a criticism that can be made of Frederick's method of war. A future opponent would write about his reaction to the book that Frederick, quote, has often done battle without good reason. To my way of thinking, you should give battle only when the advantages of victory are greater in proportion than the harm that will be consequences of a retreat or of the loss of a battle. In short, you have to be dang sure that victory will be gained if you should give battle. Overall, my thoughts are more concerned with the nature of who Frederick might have been and how that can be gained in this book. This is someone who is more willing to risk absolutely everything than any other ruler in Europe at this time, but he has a system in place to take advantage of his strengths. He was someone who was at the cutting edge of the trend of standardization that would take us into the Industrial Revolution. The drawback to that is that if you put all your eggs in one basket and the basket falls, there will be many cracked eggs. If you made it this far, clearly you like this podcast or you're crazy. But if you want to support this podcast further, feel free to donate on Patreon. The link is in the show notes below. I will leave you all with this. The true mark of a great leader is not shown when everything is going well, but when everything turns against them.